wondering how I got into this mix.
Hey everyone, this is Derek Bros of the Conscious Resistance Network. Today I'm talking with my old friend John Bush, who I've had on the show recently discussing Kratom and CBD that he sells through his company My Brave Botanicals, talking about the benefits and of course why the government doesn't want you to have access to these things. We're going to continue that conversation. I do want to remind everybody to visit theconsciousresistance.com where you can get all of our latest content, and also you'll see the ad for My Brave Botanicals where John has been kind enough to give us a free ounce of Kratom for those who want to sign up that way. And apparently plenty of you have chosen to take advantage of this opportunity. So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about some health freedom updates, and we're going to get into some of the questions and concerns around Kratom. So let's get into it. John, how are you doing?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me, and really enjoy watching all the activism you've been doing and everything you've been doing to spread liberty and peace and justice. So keep up the good work.
Absolutely. Thank you, brother. So let's start with the health freedom updates. I know you said you had maybe some positive news and then maybe some not so good news on the Kratom front. So let's talk about that.
Yeah. Well, for those not familiar, Kratom's a member of the coffee family. It's a plant medicine, essentially. It's made from the powderized leaves of the Kratom evergreen tree. There's a few different varieties. The red varieties help with chronic pain, relaxation, a little more sedative. People take it for help with sleep as well. And then the green and white ones tend to be a little more uplifting, energetic, help with focus, stress, and anxiety. And a lot of people are taking Kratom's natural plant, it's just the raw plant powder, instead of prescription, like opioids, that Vicodin, partner, my girlfriend, she stopped taking Adderall and really quit drinking things to Kratom. So this represents a threat. The bottom line, pharmaceutical companies, and so your audience is well aware. There's a revolving door. The PCs, regulators, and it's pretty bad news. And unfortunately, because of that relationship between business and government, they have the power to prohibit and ban stuff. So there's been an effort to access this amazing plant, and we're overcoming that. And that's why it's great, because it's a business for me, but it's also activism. So if people want to try it, I did make.
All right. We are recording again, so you can go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Derek. For those not familiar, Kratom's a member of the coffee family. It's made from the powderized leaves of the Kratom evergreen tree. We import ours from Indonesia. It's grown primarily in Southeast Asia. And people use the red varieties for chronic pain, relaxation, has more of a sedative effect. People use it to help sleep. And then there's green and white varieties that people take for stress and anxiety, focus, energy, and motivation also. And a lot of people take this plant medicine, just raw plant powder, instead of prescriptions. And so the pharmaceutical companies don't like that. People that used to take opioids like Oxycontin, Vicodin, Percocet are now taking the red Kratom to help with pain. People that were taking Adderall, for example, my partner was taking Adderall for a long time. She quit Adderall thanks to Kratom. And so it's affecting the bottom line of the pharmaceutical companies. And as your audience knows, the pharmaceutical companies have a cozy relationship with big government. And when they don't like things, they just go in and try to ban it like they did in 2016. Thankfully, there was huge pushback, and they didn't end up getting it added to Schedule 1 by the DEA. But since then, the FDA, who's actually the culprit of the DEA's effort to schedule it, they've been trying to influence state and local governments to ban it. And then, of course, there's some Debbie Do-Good lawmakers that get some false information, and they try to ban it as well. So there's some good news and some bad news. We'll start with the good news. There's a city, Clearwater, in Colorado, which was trying to ban Kratom just last year, towards the end of last year. And they had council meetings. The police chief wanted them to ban it. And it turns out, this is a quote from them, "Our recommendation right now is we don't think there's a need to regulate it." So they backed off after massive pushback by Kratom users in the area. They showed up in mass to the city council meeting and actually had a great impact. So that's great news. The city council members said it's not their role. This is not in our wheelhouse, said one of the council members. This is not something we need to take a position on in any way, shape, or form. This needs to be handled at either the state or federal level. So, it's happening more often than not because Kratom is just so clear cut that it's beneficial and there's very few risks. And the American Kratom Association does a lot of good work to come in and lobby those groups. So that's some positive news. Now, on the negative news, unfortunately, there's a whole slew of states that are introducing legislation to ban Kratom. For example, in Mississippi, Maryland, Missouri as well, And then on top of that, there's talk of legislation being proposed in New York, Pennsylvania, and Florida. Now, again, there's this group, the American Kratom Association, and what they're doing when these state governments come to ban Kratom is they go meet with the lawmakers. They actually have lobbying teams. So people that take Kratom or want to support health freedom, supporting the American Kratom Association is a great thing. They try to push forward the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, which is actually passed in Utah and a couple other states, I believe. And basically, this regulates Kratom. Now, as a free market guy, as an anarchist, I'm not a fan of regulation, but it is a good alternative to outright prohibiting it. So you have to register with the government if you're a Kratom vendor. All the Kratom has to be tested, which is a good thing. Our Kratom at Brave Botanicals is already regularly tested without need for legislation. But this is happening in all those states. And recently there were some hearings in Maryland. The American Kratom Association showed up, as did a bunch of activists, and they managed to talk to some of these senators and lawmakers about the Kratom Consumer Protection Act, and they're very interested. So, it's common sense. If the legislators aren't totally corrupt, which not all of them are, surprisingly, contrary to popular belief, you tell them that it's healthy, you tell them it's safe, and then they get normal average people to go share their stories of how they got their life back thanks to Kratom, especially like veterans. Lawmakers love to hear from veterans. There's veterans suffering from chronic pain or PTSD that Kratom tends to help a lot. And then you give them an alternative like this regulation through the Kratom Consumer Protection Act. And more often than not, I think the lawmakers end up doing the right thing. So that's what's taking place right now. And I'll definitely keep you in the loop and keep your listeners updated on as this pans out.
And just to clarify, so for some folks who either do want to purchase or are looking into Kratom, it as far as the federal level goes, it is not illegal.
Yeah, it's completely unregulated at the federal level. Well, I should say the FDA doesn't want people to take it. They speak out against it, but there's not any laws prohibiting it or banning it. They tried to add it to Schedule 1 along with heroin and cannabis, of all things, in 2016. But because there was such a huge pushback, 50 U.S. representatives and 10 senators signed a letter against it, and they ended up backing off. So it's totally legal. It is illegal in 6 states. And I think what happened in these 6 states is when they went to ban K2 and spice, this synthetic analog similar to, it's like synthetic marijuana, which actually does jack people up. It's chemically made, it's synthetic. And there's a big epidemic within the homeless community all over the place. I think they just kind of lumped in Kratom because it was sold next to each other in gas stations and head shops. But again, Kratom's completely natural, and the other one was synthetic. Those states are Indiana, Vermont, of all places, Alabama, Wisconsin, Rhode Island, and the last one slips me. But thankfully, it's still legal in most of the states.
Well, because I do remember we had a user through or a viewer through this channel contact you, and they tried to order some, but it was one of the states, I think Wisconsin, where it was illegal for them. So, they're not able to order it, or they have to figure some other, alternative shipping address, I guess, right?
If that suits their fancy. I won't ship it to a state where it's illegal, but if someone wants me to ship it to a state where it's legal, by all means. I've even been driving through, I forget what state it was. I think I was driving through Tennessee or something. Right when I crossed the border, I started to see signs that are like, hey, we sell Kratom here. So I think people know what's going on. And we can't accept debit cards or credit cards. That's another thing. So they can't outright ban it. But the federal government, through this program called Operation Choke Point, which came out under the Obama administration, the Department of Justice, they put pressure on the banks, which put pressure on the credit card companies not to do transactions for stuff like Kratom, CBD, firearms, adult toy stores. These are some of my favorite industries here. And so we do accept e-checks, which you simply share your checking account and routing number, and it's like an electronic check. It's drawn from your account. Totally safe and secure. Company we use, Green Dot Money, they have a A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau. Of course, we take cryptocurrency, Dash, Ethereum, Bitcoin Cash, and Bitcoin. And then we also introduced where you can mail a check. So for the people that don't feel comfortable with the e-check, again, it's totally safe and secure. I would argue safer than credit card or debit card. You can just mail a check to us, and all that stuff's on the website. But I will say, if you try to enter the e-check from a billing address that's in one of those states, it won't let you do it. So there's a fail-safe if you're curious. We also have it listed on the website what states are illegal.
Cool, yeah, man. And I actually haven't mentioned this to you yet, I don't think, but I've been meaning to reach out to you because my grandma wants some, and she's wanted, because I have a uncle who has years of back injury, back pain, back surgeries, all this kind of stuff. And of course they put him on opiates, like, you're talking about pain pills, and he'll drink a beer occasionally, but he's not a person who enjoys being intoxicated. And unfortunately he was pretty quickly getting hooked on these opiate painkillers. And, he's in his late 50s, so he's not interested in getting hooked on anything. And so he basically gave it up all cold turkey and now pretty much just deals with the pain. But I was recently telling him and my grandmother about Kratom and about your shop and whatnot. So yeah, I'm gonna have to connect her to you to get that taken care of so they can try it out. But let's now move into, you sort of talked about some of it already, the propaganda and some of the objections, because, we know the FDA and the DEA are putting out different horror stories of Kratom killing people. And we covered some of this in the last interview, but let's get a little further into that. Some of the propaganda and some of the objections. I kind of mentioned that I've had people comment here and there when they hear me mention Kratom in the videos. Oh, how dare you promote this, addictive or destructive thing. And sometimes people will provide their own anecdotal evidence of, say, hey, I tried Kratom and I got into it for a while and I found myself hooked, in one way or another. Let's kind of explore all that.
Sure. First, let's just get it out of the way. Then I'd love to go in depth on the addiction thing, because it is controversial, and I shoot people straight. And I will say that Kratom can be addictive. It can be habit forming. Someone can have a physical dependency on Kratom. But I have a lot of great tips on how to avoid that. And so, but first, one of the biggest things, it's hard to be in this industry because I talk to people about Kratom and seeing its praises, and then they go Google Kratom and it's like all these headlines, alarmist headlines, like Kratom, the herbal killer and all sorts of stuff. But let's just debunk some of that real quick. I know you're an awesome journalist and you always kind of get behind the surface. And unfortunately, a lot of mainstream journalists don't do that. But a while back, the FDA put out a report saying there were 44 Kratom-related deaths. Now, notice they say Kratom-related deaths. Turns out this is just totally bogus. In most of those deaths, there were other substances found in the systems, like fentanyl, heroin, all sorts of stuff. Some of those 44, they were doubled. This is from American Kratom Association. They put out something just totally blasting it. Some of them had heroin. Some of them overdosed on stuff, but they also were taking Kratom. And it wasn't Kratom that was the cause of death. And one of the biggest things that just really illustrates how bogus this is, and again, the mainstream media, they'll just take the FDA's press release of 44 Kratom-related deaths, and not all of them, very few of them that actually have integrity will go realize these inconsistencies. But they'll just run with the headline, 44 deaths from Kratom, not even Kratom-related deaths, or they have other stuff. But the biggest thing was that some of those 44 had committed suicide. One of them was a homicide with a gunshot wound to the chest, and they just happened to have Kratom in their system, and this got included. One of them had a cardiac arrhythmia while swimming. One of them had deep vein thrombosis, and so they died of these other causes. And then finally, the most egregious is someone had Kratom in their system, and they fell out of a window and died. So you can see that it's not, this isn't Kratom that's killing these people. I would argue, so I'm not going to say that Kratom can't kill you, because you could die from drinking too much water. But I would say that it is highly unlikely that someone could overdose on Kratom from taking Kratom alone. And the beauty, especially if you're not taking the extracts, which we can talk about when we talk about addiction, is there's like an internal mechanism built in where if you start to take too much Kratom, your body's going to force you to vomit. And maybe you'll have flu-like symptoms. I actually had flu-like symptoms for a whole day when I was experimenting with extracts, and I was taking them and I was like, oh, I haven't felt anything. Maybe I'll try this other kind. No, I don't feel anything still. Maybe I'll try this other kind. Well, I never really felt the effects of the Kratom, and it turns out like I had like flu-like symptoms for a day, but that's your signal to like, hey, maybe I need to stop trying this, right? This was a couple of years ago. I don't like the extracts for that reason and others. On top of the 44 Kratom-related deaths, the CDC a couple of years later put out a press release about 91 Kratom-related deaths. So they did this study where they looked at the study was titled Unintentional Kratom Doses with Kratom Detected, and the CDC examined 27,338 overdose deaths that occurred between July 26th and December 2017. Of the 27,338, only 152 tested positive for Kratom on post-mortem toxicology. That's not a lot, especially when you compare it to the scores and scores of deaths from opioids and opiates. But it goes further. Of these 91, only 7 of them had kratom alone in their system. All of the other ones, like I said before, had opioids, cocaine, benzodiazepines, and even heroin. And then in those 7, the coroners say they admit that the presence of additional substances cannot be ruled out. So this is the type of information that gets parroted by the mainstream media. This is the type of information that these Debbie Do-Gooder lawmakers come across, and they think it's some big problem when in reality, it's a bunch of misinformation and propaganda. So I appreciate you having me on your program to come and dispel some of this bogus stuff. In reality, kratom is relatively safe. Now, let's get...
Well, I just want to say one thing on there just to clarify, because you kind of answered what I was going to ask next, which is it doesn't seem like there's very strong evidence of a death that is linked to kratom where the person has nothing else in their system. They didn't fall out of a window. They didn't get shot, where it's just, this person took kratom and, the next day they're dead or something like that. Right. I mean, it seems like the evidence for that is pretty thin, if non-existent.
I haven't been able to find one example of a clear-cut case of someone taking too much kratom. More often than not, it's probably someone that was suffering from heroin addiction or other addictions, and they started to take kratom to try to get some normalcy, and they just took too much. And then again, there's some people, I'm not going to say kratom, just anybody should take it, no caution whatsoever, right? It's all about personal responsibility, being in touch with our body. And for people that are genuinely concerned, maybe they're taking other prescription medications, they can consult with their physician if they want to be absolutely safe. Because there's some people that already have a myriad of health problems, or maybe they have an addiction or dependency on pills, and then they take kratom on top of that. But yeah, like you said, it's highly unlikely that someone would take kratom and kratom alone could kill somebody. Yeah.
All right. Yeah, I just wanted to make that clear to everybody. Go on. I think you had another point.
Well, yeah, you mentioned that some people were, addiction, and I've had that same thing. People have given me flack about selling kratom. And, to be very clear and very honest, kratom interacts with the body's opioid receptors. That's how it helps with pain, right? It also interacts with the dopamine and serotonin receptors, which is why it helps with stress and anxiety and an overall sense of well-being. And I've been looking more into the work of Dr. Gabor Mate. He's a physician that focuses on addiction and trauma, right? And his whole thesis is that people are more susceptible to addiction when they have had trauma in their childhood, and when they were neglected as little infants. The body releases endorphins, and your system, the love hormones come out whenever you're getting warmth and love from a mother. And if you don't have that warmth and love from a mother, whenever you take drugs, you feel that warmth because the same endorphins come out and stuff. He's got some really great in-depth stuff, but I've been really learning a lot about the science behind addiction. And when someone's taking cocaine, for example, or these opioids, that starts to stimulate the opioid receptors, interact with the opioid receptors, the alkaloids in kratom and in these opioids will bind with the opioid receptors. And the body's like, oh, well, opioid receptors are getting triggered and endorphins are being pushed out and other hormones and neurotransmitters by this substance that's being taken by the body. We don't need to do our job as much. And they kind of back off a little bit. That's one of the reasons for people that are addicted to something and then they want to quit. They feel terrible because it takes months upon months for those opioid transmitters and the neurotransmitters to get back to a place of balance and normalcy. So kratom being an opioid, interacting with opioid receptors, the more and more you take kratom, the more your body is going to rely on that kratom to move those opioid receptors forward. So one thing I want to point out, there are people that become really addicted to kratom, dependent on kratom, taking so much kratom that if they were to stop, they have withdrawal symptoms. And I used to think that the withdrawal symptoms were very minor and moderate, but I stumbled upon a Reddit subgroup with like over 10,000 people that was people that were struggling with addiction and dependency to kratom. And I read some of those stories and accounts, and some of the withdrawal symptoms were pretty damn severe. So I want to point out that a lot of the people that become really hooked on kratom and take a whole lot of kratom, like an ounce a day, for example, something that normally should last a week or so, They were formerly addicted to kratom, maybe even, heroin, maybe even still suffering with heroin addiction or like hardcore opioids. And it's an example of harm reduction. So if someone's addicted to heroin and then they quit heroin because kratom helps to minimize the withdrawal symptoms, so it helps with that transition to sobriety. Now they become dependent on kratom and they're pounding it to the point where they would have physical withdrawal symptoms. This is an example of harm reduction because, like we talked about just a second ago, the kratom's not going to kill you, unlike heroin, which could kill you. Getting a batch laced with fentanyl, taking too much, or unlike taking too many Percocets or Oxycontins or fentanyl, that could kill you. So addiction is a problem. There's no quick and easy solution to addiction. And yes, there are people that simply become addicted to kratom after a stronger addiction, but I still will have compassion, not going to judge anyone if that's the case. And like I said, for me, that's an example of harm reduction, and that's helping and benefiting people. I just put out an article on 3 tips how to avoid developing a tolerance and becoming dependent on kratom. So just like anything, people come dependent on coffee. And then when they start, someone super close to me for so long, when they wouldn't drink caffeine, they would have massive migraine headaches, which is a pretty severe withdrawal symptom, right? So responsible use is the key.
Yeah, I just want to
steps.
I want to add to that real quick, John. Well, 2 things. For one, like what you were just going into with coffee, I tell this to friends all the time that, okay, imagine when you hear somebody who says, oh, I can't function if I don't have my coffee in the morning, and replace that with crack or cocaine or heroin or any other drug. And people would be like, whoa, dude, you got an issue, man. You got something to work on. But it's kind of commonly accepted. It's like, oh, I need my coffee and my cigarette in the morning before I can function. So I do think it's important for people to kind of step back before we attack kratom or any other sort of other alternative substance that's not a pharmaceutical, to step back and sort of evaluate what you might already be addicted to or dependent on or already have habits about. And then the other thing is just speaking as somebody, the audience knows that I've been addicted to several drugs in the past, over a decade ago, but one of them was to MDMA. And MDMA works specifically on the serotonin receptors. And I can say, after being somebody who was taking lots of MDMA, ecstasy pills several times a week for about 6 months, that when that period ended, when I finally decided to stop, it took probably another 6 months to a year for my serotonin receptors to rebuild. And I felt there was a period where I really felt like a zombie, where I felt like I couldn't express joy, or it wasn't even like I was sad. I just couldn't really feel anything, because I'd spent so much time depleting those things. So I do think what you had said a few moments ago is important, that if you're coming into kratom use and maybe you're coming as somebody who's trying to break away from other addictions, you have to consider the damage that's already been done to those receptors. And, and again, it's up to personal response, individual use. There is the positive aspect that you're reducing the harm. Okay. You're getting away from heroin or something like that for kratom. But there's also the term that gets thrown around, cross addiction, right? So it is important for people who maybe have, it could be a genetic thing. I have a family that has addiction going back several generations. So I've had to personally learn, even with, say, cannabis, like with my cannabis use, like, all right, I'm going to stop for a couple of weeks just to make sure I'm the one in control here, right? Because I don't like that feeling of like, oh, I need my weed or whatever. Like, after everything I've been through, I don't like feeling dependent on anything. So I just want to emphasize that it's up to you to be individually responsible. And if you're coming into considering kratom or anything, and you've already got previous addictions or struggles, you need to be the one to evaluate that and to be smart about it. So I just wanted to add that in there.
Yeah, for sure. And on that same note, if someone was formerly addicted to heroin or opioids and now they're clean, then you don't need to take kratom, right? Unless you're stressed or anxious or there's some need. But if you're clean and life's good, don't take the kratom, because if you take a good amount of some strong kratom, you have some euphoria. And maybe even like a little subtle warmness. It's not to the point like you're taking a Vicodin. I used to take Vicodin recreationally, like back in college and stuff. And you got that warmness and like kind of itchy. That feels good, right? Kratom has a very subtle effect similar to that. So the caution is, if you're totally clean and sober and then you get that feeling again, you're like, oh man, that reminds me of the good old days. And now the endorphins are going to come out even thinking about that. And that could lead you back down the path. So it's really good for people that have some sort of struggle, and especially people that are wanting to transition away from sobriety. And another thing, this is why I appreciate your work in the holistic anarchy and the self-assessment, is that kratom is a surface level solution. And a lot of people become addicted and they take alcohol, heroin at the most extreme level, MDMA, to help numb some sort of pain, right? From trauma or PTSD or whatever it may be. And we have to, this is the hardest part. And this is why so many people struggle with addiction, is you got to face the demons and you got to take a look in the mirror and you got to face that trauma, which many people want to cover up, understandably so. And it's difficult. You got to forgive yourself. You got to forgive if you were abused. You got to forgive the abusers. You got to really do that deep work. And so that's something that I try to emphasize. Selling Kratom, I realize a lot of my customers struggle with addiction. Not all of them, but some of them struggle with addiction formerly or even currently. So I started the Brave New You Recovery Support Group. People can find that on Facebook. Maybe get a link to it. And that's where people can go and just have community, no judgment zone. And of course, you have the holistic self-assessment, which would help with a lot of this stuff. And you kind of got to bring that stuff to the surface. And that's really what needs to take place at the end of the day. Because like you said, trading one addiction for another isn't ideal. But like I did say, and you pointed out as well, it is an example of harm reduction. So at least you're not going to overdose and die, which would be the ultimate disaster through, that's the biggest thing that could come from addiction, the worst thing. So,
So I think you're already kind of covering them, but I think you wanted to go into some more best practices. I mean, we've already sort of, I think, started to get into that.
Yeah, the best way to avoid developing a tolerance, because this is how we get down the slippery slope, is you take Kratom for a while, it becomes a daily use for many people. And then the more you take it, the more tolerant your body's systems come to it, and then you have to take more. And by now, you could become physically dependent. So I would probably argue that most people that take Kratom don't have any physical withdrawal symptoms whatsoever. There's been periods where I've taken Kratom every single day for a pretty extended period, a moderate amount of Kratom. And when I stopped taking it, I would feel no withdrawal symptoms whatsoever. There's been other times where the extent of what I would feel would be restlessness and trouble sleeping. And that's about it. No wet dog shakes or headaches or migraines or anything like that. But I took note of that. I was like, wow, I need to take breaks more often. So the best thing you could do is take breaks. So if it becomes a daily use, then maybe every week or so, you take 2 to 3 days off or more. This gives not only your receptors an opportunity to be like, hey, we have a job to do on our own without this Kratom, but it also gives your kidneys and your liver an opportunity to have a little reset, because the alkaloids in Kratom, mitragynine, 7-hydroxymitragynine, among others, they have to be filtered out of your system. And it helps to do that. So that's the first tip, is to take breaks, even take a week or two off if you can, to really give your body an opportunity to relax. And this is the same thing as fasting in general. Everything we put in our body, soda, sugar, especially if you're like eating non-organic foods and fast food and stuff, you want to give your body an opportunity to flush all of that out instead of just constantly piling it on. The body never has an opportunity to be at like a default state of goodness. And then the second tip, this is an article I posted recently. Maybe you could share it in the comments or in the show notes. The second tip is, if you're still struggling with pain or anxiety during those breaks, then maybe try another plant remedy like CBD, for example. We also sell CBD. We just started selling CBD flower, which is super cool. It has that same enjoyment of smoking, but it doesn't have the THC, which makes some people feel paranoid and is illegal in some states. I don't know if that's going to stop any of your listeners, though. But kava kava is another example. Or if you're in pain, turmeric is really good for inflammation. So that's the second tip. And you can also alternate. So maybe this week I'm going to take Kratom. This week I'll be taking CBD for my lower back pain, for example. And then the final tip, the second one is during these breaks to try a different plant remedy. And then the third tip would be just try different strains. So some people will we have 5 different strains: Green Mangda, Super Green Dragon. Those are our green varieties. White Lightning is our only white. It's more uplifting, energetic. And then Red, Relaxation, and OG Bali. So we have a sample pack. Whenever you do the free ounce offer, bros.freeounceofkratom.com, you can buy a free ounce of Green Mangda Kratom. It's just $5 shipping and handling. We'll send it to you. But once you add that to cart, you're presented with a one-time offer to get all 4 of our other strains for 50% off. It comes out to $28.75. And so maybe you take it for stress and anxiety, and you find that the Super Green Dragon, the Green Mangda, and the White Lightning all help you. And maybe the reds are a little bit too sedative and they're not good for you to go out during the day. So the thing to do is like, okay, for 1 week you take the Green Mangda. The next week you take the Super Green Dragon. Then you take your break. Then you come back and you take your white lightning. This way you're taking a different type, and it'll still have the desired effect without having to take more. Because again, it's that slippery slope when you start taking more of something, whether it's booze, cannabis, opioids. That's when you start taking more of it. The more you take, the more likely you are to become physically dependent and addicted as well. And so those are my 3 tips to avoid this, because it's a very real possibility that we all should be aware of. And anybody that tells you Kratom is not going to be addictive or you don't have anything to worry about, they're being dishonest with you.
Yeah, I agree. And I appreciate that. And I will go ahead, we'll put in the show notes, both of the stories on the pushback against Kratom as well as the victory you mentioned, and we'll also put those tips there. One other question that just came to mind, because recently, just last week, I interviewed some of the researchers here in Houston. There's a study going on right now. They're studying the latest study on psilocybin treating addiction and depression and things of that sort. Have there been any clinical trials, like specifically with Kratom, looking at addiction, or just any other just trials in general?
There haven't been clinical trials. So the FDA doesn't want people to take Kratom for medical benefit. Then it becomes a drug. And if it's considered a drug, then you have to do this new dietary ingredient stuff, and you have to go through all these trials, which can cost upwards of hundreds of millions of dollars, if not more. That's when you do your double-blind placebo clinical trials and stuff. And nobody in the I'm certainly not going to put up hundreds of $millions to do that right now. I actually prefer some would call it the wild, wild west, but it's not wild or anything at all. Again, our stuff's tested. You can go with reputable vendors that have good reviews, and that's personal responsibility as a consumer. But there haven't been actual clinical trials. There have been these studies where they do like epidemiological reviews, where they'll go in and find all sorts of anecdotal information and all sorts of stuff, and they'll analyze it, and they'll go with testimonials. And then there's like doctors that will go work with patients, and so a lot of the science, when you actually have a peer-reviewed research paper, sounds pretty promising when it comes to overcoming addiction and this opioid epidemic. So no, there haven't been clinical trials, but there's all sorts of anecdotal evidence and just general research that does say a lot of people are using it with very minimal withdrawal symptoms and problems. I got this book about overcoming opioid addiction. And it has some good general insights and info for me about the science and stuff, but the doctor's solution is methadone and other similar opioids, right? And of course, this helps people to taper off, and it's better than taking the heroin or the opioids, but a lot of people just become dependent on the methadone, which has all sorts of problems. As well. Yeah, Suboxone, and it's more taxing on the liver and kidneys, way more than a natural plant like Kratom. So I think there's a lot of opportunity that Kratom has. And again, Kratom, one of the big things about Kratom for chronic pain and how Kratom really could help turn around this opioid epidemic is it doesn't cause respiratory depression like these opioids do. That's how people that overdose on opioids, they usually die from their lungs just stop. They just shut down. Kratom doesn't have that. There's also promise, and some people like Dr. Christopher McCurdy out of Florida School of Pharmacology, University of Florida, he's trying to learn about synthesizing Kratom and creating a pharmaceutical out of it. I think it's best to take the raw plant, but for people that aren't familiar with that or feel uncomfortable with that, or doctors don't want to prescribe it, they are going into the science of trying to synthesize the active alkaloids in Kratom, which would be able to create somewhat of an opioid that doesn't cause respiratory depression, which would be able to help a lot of people.
Awesome, man. Well, I appreciate all the information. Again, for those who haven't seen our previous interview and want more of a sort of introduction to the Kratom plan, you can check that out. I'll put that in the show notes, as well as everything else that John mentioned. And again, if you didn't hear the address, it's bros.freeounceofkratom.com. Of course, we'll put that link below. And as he said, you can get yourself a free ounce of Kratom, and then there's a special for the other strains as well, right?
Yep, you add the free ounce to cart, and then you're presented with a one-time offer to get the other 4 strains for 50% off. So it comes out to $33.75 for all 5 of the strains. Again, we don't do credit card or debit card. The preferred method is e-check. You share your checking account routing number. Totally safe and secure. I've been doing it for 2 years, never had any issues. Or you can do cryptocurrency if you're into that, which I know a lot of your listeners are. Or if you feel most comfortable, you can mail a check or money order, cashier's check. Or if it's just the $5 free ounce, you could even mail a little $5 bill folded up. I wouldn't mail a bunch of cash, but those are some other options as well.
Awesome, John. Well, I appreciate it. And again, it's bros.freeounceofkratom.com. John's website is My Brave Botanicals. And if you go to theconsciousresistance.com, you'll see our little banner we have there. We're going to leave it there for now, guys. I hope you learned something, and this discussion has been informative. I know I learned a few things. And as I said earlier, addiction is something that's been prevalent in my own personal life and my family's life. So I always enjoy hearing about the alternatives. And, coincidentally, in the nearly 2 decades since 9/11, we've had U.S. soldiers guarding opium plants. We've had an explosion of this opium epidemic. And at the same time, you have the federal government going after a possible solution in the form of this plant. So we need to really look at that. And I hope those of you who are struggling in this way will at least consider checking out John's products and see what you think about Kratom. Anything else you want to add, John?
No, just everybody out there, enjoy life. Life's beautiful. If you're stressed out, try to just be grateful for the things that you have and love one another. And that's really the way that we're going to change the world for the better.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for listening. This is Derek Bros of the Conscious Resistance. Until next time, remember, you are powerful, you are beautiful, and you are free. Peace.